sky. To whom do these celestial steeds belong? When you appear to us like gods on high, what brings you here to mystify?
Hi, Kate Valentine here, welcoming you to the UFO show on 1160 WVNJ. It is my great pleasure to announce that back with us today is Mr. Frank Feschino. Frank was last on the show to discuss his book, Shoot Them Down, and if you have not yet read this book, please get a copy and do so. It is essential ufology reading. And now today he's here to discuss his recently released, newly updated and revised edition of the Braxton County Monster, the cover-up of the Flatwoods Monster Revealed. The release of this book was scheduled to coincide with the just passed 60th anniversary of the famous Flatwoods Monster incident. Welcome to the show, Frank. Thanks for taking the time to be here.
Glad to be here again.
Oh, I'll tell you, one of the problems I have in sort of getting the questions together to ask you is that your book covers so much, or your books, I should say, in so much detail. I hope 1 hour does justice to it. I really do, because it is essential reading. And the point I want to make, and I think it's so important, the details you bring out is that in 1952, and Flap just doesn't seem to do justice to it. In 1952, this main point leaps out at you. There was an air war in 1952. Our Air Force engaged these craft. Some were shot down, and one of those shooting downs led to what you then call the Braxton Monster cover-up. And that's a phenomenal statement, Frank.
Well, one thing a lot of people don't realize, Kate, is that the Air Defense Command had been chasing flying saucers and UFOs for several years.
Yes.
And so it wasn't anything unusual. Project Blue Book alone, there was 28 Blue Book unknown cases that involved fighter planes and UFOs. Majority of them were jets. That was between 1948 and 1959. And especially in 1952, the Air Defense Command had their state-of-the-art jets, which were the best jets we had at the time, were always surrounding the D.C. area. The rocket-bearing Starfire, it was an F-94C. The Air Force had the F-86D and the F-7U-3 Cutlass. The Navy all had these Mighty Mouse rockets on them, and they were basically around the Washington area. These jets were not used in Korea for fear of the Soviets getting their hands on one if one had crashed. So we had the best jets stateside. These jets were sent out on the back-to-back weekend sightings in July, and on the night of the Flatwoods Monster incident, what I discovered is the story was a lot bigger than just the isolated incident that seemed to occur in Flatwoods, West Virginia. There was 4 damaged UFOs that had come in across the United States and made repeated crash landings. And that was basically the gist of the story of what I had discovered. And it was basically the first time that anybody had gone to the depths that I have to find out what actually occurred.
It's amazing to me. So you visit family in West Virginia, and you hear about this story of the Braxton County Monster, and you start to investigate. One thing leads to another, and here you uncover this enormous story that really should be front headlines all over.
Well, it took over 20 years to find this out. Your listeners, don't misunderstand. This was something that happened real quick. I started over 20 years ago. And what got me interested in the case at the beginning, Kate, wasn't so much the story of the monster. It was the reactions of the people in Braxton County when I was walking around and trying to get interviews and talk to some of the people that were involved in this. And it wasn't easy. And then later on, I found out, as I started looking into the story, the deeper level, that the people involved and the locals in Braxton County, we have Flatwoods, Sutton, Gasaway, that little area, the people were made fools of for this particular incident. A monster, a pumpkin-headed monster, as I call it, with wearing a cloak dress, similar to a monk's outfit, with a tunic top and this hooded cloth thing over the top of its head. And I found out it actually was not a monster. It was some type of a mechanical type spacesuit probe.
Well, you know, you have to say, though, back then it almost sounded like the old-fashioned 50s sci-fi movies, you know, a bunch of little kids playing football behind a school out there in a small hamlet in the hills of West Virginia. This flaming craft goes overhead, and they start chasing it down. They get Miss May to grab a flashlight and go out and look for it. They take the dogs with them. I mean, it's classic Americana. And it was so twisted by the press by the time they got finished with it because, you know, these people actually saw something. And as far as the 12-foot owl, that's ridiculous. I mean, these were country people. They were not about to mistake a 12-foot owl for anything other than a 12-foot owl. I don't even, are there 12 feet owls? I don't even know.
Not that I know of.
I don't think so. It's a pretty big owl.
One of the key things we have to remember here is 6 weeks before the Flatwoods incident occurred, Kate, there was an international news service article, and it was Air Force orders jet pilots to shoot down flying saucers if they refused to land. And the article, quote, stated, Lieutenant Colonel Monsell Montz, information officer, stated the jet pilots are and have been under orders to investigate unidentified objects and to shoot them down if they can't talk them down. In Air Force parlance, this means that if a flying saucer refuses to land, jet pilots are authorized to shoot them to Earth. And that's a very key important part here because as I started looking into the Flatwoods case, I went outside of Braxton County, went outside of West Virginia, and I was able to establish that there was 102 locations over 21 hours of sustained sightings where UFOs were seen. I started plotting these points as I started finding them. And a good chunk of the sightings and the information I actually found in Project Blue Book, Kate, and it was loaded with information. And that kind of started the trail to get me onto the path to look into different newspapers. So in the end, we have 102 locations over 9 East Coast states. And I worked with military people, and you know, I don't have a military background, but I've learned a lot over 20 years. And by working with these fellows, we put together this gigantic master map, which could be seen on my website, flatwoodsmonster.com. On the home page, there's a section called Quick Links. If you click onto that map, you will see the actual map that we were able to establish what happened that night. And to make a long story short, it was basically connect the dots. We had the times, the locations, the trajectories. We knew the directions all these UFOs were flying over these 21 hours. And the crux of it happened within about a 45-minute period where 3 damaged UFOs came over the mid-Atlantic eastern seaboard, and they went into different directions. The first object flew towards Tennessee, and it actually flew towards Oak Ridge National Laboratory. There was minutes later, another UFO came in over the seaboard, flew over Baltimore, and it flew up towards Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And they neared very close, and we're going to call them targets because they were targeting them. And you could look at my map, and you will actually see how close they came. The first object actually penetrated the no-fly zone of Oak Ridge by nearly 100 miles. And as the second one was approaching Wright-Patterson up in Ohio, a third object came down the middle, kind of like threaded the needle, and it passed over Washington, D.C., That was reported as the flame over Washington in the New York Times. And that was actually the Flatwoods monster craft. And along its flight path trajectory as it flew west, Kate, it was actually hitting the treetops and burning the treetops. There were pieces flying off of these objects. They were exploding, had sparks coming off of them. And as this third object came over Washington, D.C. at a low level, there were actually 12 UFOs that descended out of the sky and formed an aerial perimeter. And it was the states were Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., And as they formed this aerial perimeter around this damaged object, they followed it west. When it got a safe way away from Washington, D.C., they ascended back up into the sky and disappeared. I found all of this information out in Project Blue Book.
Really?
Yeah, all of these sightings were in Blue Book. They were tentative observers questionnaires. In my updated book, I have new documents. I discovered that on the West Coast, there was interceptor chases against a UFO going on simultaneously as everything unfolded on the East Coast. A lot of new information, new Blue Book reports. I have Harry Truman's telephone memorandum that I was able to link together to the time events as they unfolded over the Mid-Atlantic to what Truman was doing. Stan Friedman got me that document. So what we have here is all these damaged UFOs coming across the United States, and there was actually another damaged UFO that came from the direction of Florida, and it came from the south as the other were heading across the Mid-Atlantic. This other object came from the direction of Florida over North Carolina, and it flew into Virginia, and it passed into West Virginia. The whole gist of the Flatwoods Monster story we were able to establish is Flatwoods was a rendezvous area for damaged craft to be put down together, and it failed miserably. That's why when I started looking into the original notes and the original stories of the Flatwoods Monster case that Ivan Sanderson and Gray Barker had been studying, they did a lot of interviews and spoke to people, and those guys were pulling their hair out because they couldn't figure out why were there so many different craft seen flying over Braxton County, and they all merged over Flatwoods. And as you tighten it up, they merged over one little farm where there was a plateau on the back mountaintop. All of these UFOs were flying over a little plateau, just, a couple acres. Why all of these UFOs? They couldn't figure it out. Back in the 50s, Project Blue Book was still classified.
Okay. Well, Frank,
I was able to get all of this together and figure it out.
Yeah, and I want, we're going to take a quick break, but I want you to tell the audience how you managed to do that, because it's an excellent example of research in this field. Kate Valentine here. I'm speaking with Frank Feschino. He is the author of both Shoot Them Down and the newly revised and edited version of the Braxton County Monster, the Flatwoods Monster Cover-Up Revealed. We're on 1160 WVNJ, and both Frank and I would love to hear what you think about all this. Please post your comments now on our website, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. After the show, you can find out so much more about both books on Frank's website, flatwoodsmonster.com. And Frank, if there's a better website, let us know right after the break. We'll be right back. Hi, welcome back to the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. With us again today is Mr. Frank Feschino. He is discussing the newly revised edition of the Braxton County Monster, the cover-up of the Flatwoods Monster Revealed. We'd love to have you join our conversation. You can do that by posting your thoughts on our website, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. After the show, you can find out a lot more about these books. And Frank, the website I have for you is flatwoodsmonster.com. Is that correct, or is there a better one?
Yeah, Flatwoodsmonster.
Yeah.
.com.
Okay. Right. Well, I'll tell you, before the break, you were saying about how you backtracked all of these sightings, and your most appropriate analogy in your book was that it was a huge jigsaw puzzle, and you backtracked all these so-called meteors, and that created that map that you're speaking about, that phenomenal map.
Right.
And and there were, my understanding is that there were three separate objects that you brought back to one point over the Atlantic, and then a military historian said that you were just looking two-dimensionally. And if you had looked three-dimensionally, you would have seen that all three of these craft were dropped from a higher level in the atmosphere down and then took off. And when they took off, they went into the air defense zone. They were unidentified, and at that point attacked by jet rockets that took them by surprise. And I think that was I think you're correct in that, and that was all detective work on your part. Congratulations.
That was exactly what happened, but I can't take the credit for everything because the military guys, particularly one guy, is the one that helped figure it out. He took the map off the wall, and he said, Frank, do you ever see the World War II movies where they show the guys, and they have the different levels of the clear glass, and they're moving around? You see submarines on the bottom, you see the ships on the top, then you see the aircraft, and they're maneuvering them around with the sticks. He said, that's how you have to think. And he pulled the map off the wall, and we laid it on the ground. He says, now we're making this into a 3D. And that's basically what you had just described. I was thinking too one-dimensionally. And that's when it all pulled together and I was able to understand it.
So such a big thing was going on in 1952, and you're really bringing it to the fore through your two books. That's why I want to keep stressing them to the audience. Doug wrote in, and he said that assuming the Flatwood monster alien craft was shot down and damaged by our military, do you have any opinion why the alien did not retaliate by harming the people of Flatwood who encountered this monster?
Well, I can't speak for the aliens, but I could say they were civilians. There was no threat of Mrs. May and a bunch of little kids against this 12-foot-tall metallic structure. When you're up in the air and if you have Starfires and Sabre jets flying at you and shooting Mighty Mouse rockets, which must have been a bloody mess up there. You can picture hundreds of these rockets flying around. And, during that point, those rockets, they were folding fin aerial rockets, and they traveled at about 2,500 feet per second from a standing platform. So they were actually moving quicker because these jets were flying between 600 and 700 miles an hour. So you look at an air battle with this going on, it must have been crazy. And as you said before, all of those 3 points where the damaged objects came in were intersected 90 miles off the mid-Atlantic coast, directly 200 miles east of Washington, D.C. And if you look at the master map, basically, Kate, what you have is the intersect point, then you go 200 miles inland west, you have Washington, and if you go about 200 miles more further west, it's Flatwoods. It's almost a straight line. So when this object came in, it flew over Washington, flew about 206 miles west. It redirected and headed into Braxton County. That's when it passed over the school playground, made a 45-degree angle turn, and landed up on the back of the Fisher farm. How I started putting all of this stuff together is the Flatwoods case, the incident happened on September 12th, which was a Friday night. And when I started looking into the stories about this monster, we're going to call it a monster for namesake, but I started looking on the September 13th newspapers. The story hadn't broken to the press yet because it was late by the time the story got across the news wires. I started finding articles across the United States. I'll read a couple of them because they're pretty powerful. 4 states bombarded by meteor-like objects. Mystery lights zip through skies here, stirring furor. Fireballs shower city area. Mystery light zips through valley skies. Score see green light over area. I have dozens of newspaper articles of this type of activity. People thought they were crashing airplanes. I was able to establish there was a dozen between all of these damaged UFOs. There was a dozen different landing sites. And, excuse me, that's all represented on the map. So I was able to put together a very solid flight path trajectory for each one of these objects. And all the damaged ones were flying at treetop level, coming in on fire, exploding, pieces falling off of them. So it was a pretty crazy night what was going on. It wasn't pieced together because this happened over such a wide area. It hadn't been put together. Basically, one hand didn't know what the other one was doing.
And also, the Internet wasn't around. The media weren't quite as prevalent as they are today either. And I think, and certainly, I'm sure the military tried to keep it as quiet as possible. And Alfred had responded to the last comment, and he said that although he didn't think that you would speculate, he will, and he just feels that they are better men than we are, maybe. I don't know, as far as why they didn't retaliate. I also feel that I agree with you, like there was just really no reason to. And so you feel that this thing that these people saw was actually like a sort of a safety, like an escape shuttle or an escape pod type thing?
Yes, because when the thing touched down, Kate, it touched on down on the back of the Bailey Fisher farm, which was a cleared plateau. The kids saw it go down. I interviewed another witness, Jack Davis, an adult, who saw this coming in from another end of town, and he told me this thing was coming in very slow. It was coming in, at a treetop level, and actually there was a section in Flatwoods that was burned where this thing came along, hit the treetops. And when it set down, it was glowing. What it actually did is it relocated into the second field of the farm, which is a gully area, and it was tucked away back in the corner because it was glowing, and you could see it for quite a distance. So what it actually did is it made itself, into a little hidden gully. At that point, the boys had run up to Mrs. May's house in the neighborhood, and two of the boys in the group, Fred and Ed, this was their mom, they all gathered, and that's when they went up to go onto the farm, and that's when the encounter occurred with this, we're going to call it the Flatwoods Monster, but it was actually a craft. The big misconception about this case was a week later after this incident occurred, Mrs. May, Jean Lemon, who was an 18-year-old cousin, who were up close to this monster, were interviewed. We the people, Dan Seymour was the host, and everybody sat down, and there was a sketch artist there. And he interviewed Lemon and May, and he came up with this cockamamie-looking monster wearing a cloth outfit. This thing was actually metallic. And when I started working, being an illustrator, trained in oils, I sat down with the witnesses, and I started doing the drawings as they were explaining, like police-style renderings. Mm-hmm. And I discovered this thing was actually metallic in structure, and it was some type of a spacesuit, and it was a hovercraft. And when I came out initially a few years ago with these drawings and illustrations, what had happened is the skeptics and a lot of the naysayers were like, oh, this guy Feschino, he's got a hell of an imagination. Now he's got this thing looking like a rocket ship. So I went back and I researched a little bit further, Kate, and I found out that on September 14th, 1952, 2 days after the incident, the Charleston Daily Mail had actually described this creature, and they talk about it being metallic. And then there was another follow-up article, and this article was in the Gazette paper. Now, this was on the 15th. This is still a few days before that misconception drawing, and the article was Braxton Monster left skid marks where he landed, and the witnesses actually described this thing and said it looked like a mechanical man and wore a suit of green armor, was 10 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and had a blood-red face, and sported a black spade-like cowl which extended a foot or more above its head. So when you look back in the history here, the witnesses did give the correct descriptions of this thing as looking almost like a mechanical man, something wearing a suit of armor. And so this proves how this was all consistent at the beginning, and after that TV show where the artist drew the picture incorrectly, that's when the rumors and the story went crazy, and that's when it fell apart.
Well,
so
that's
the
why
witnesses were right in giving me their descriptions.
Of course, and I'll tell you, that's why the press is so important, and it really is a shame that it isn't getting to be a little bit more responsible as far as reporting all these sightings. This is Kate Valentine, and I'm speaking with Frank Feschino. He is the author of Shoot Them Down and the newly revised and edited version of the Braxton County Monster, the Flatwoods Monster cover-up revealed. We're on 1160 WVNJ. We have to take a short break, but both Frank and I would love to hear what you think about this. Please post your comments on our website, AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. After the show, you can find out so much more about both books on Frank's website, FlatwoodsMonster.com. Be right back. Hi, welcome back to the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. With us again today is Mr. Frank Feschino. He is discussing his newly revised edition of the Braxton County Monster. Love to have your thoughts. Post them now on our AtlanticCoastUFOs.com. After the show, you can find out so much more on Frank's website, FlatwoodsMonster.com. Frank, we had some interesting questions that came in. Unified Field would like to know, can you explain the difference between the two editions and whether the editors changed or eliminated facts from the original edition because somebody told them to? And can you describe the droid in the famous entity encounter? Well, I guess you just did describe that. But was there some pressure to change the original book?
I don't know, Kate, and I may never know.
Okay.
But I could say one thing: the 2004 edition book had 154 documented mistakes in it.
Really?
And I was actually out on book tour, and I didn't know that the final galley was changed because it was an absolute disgrace. It looked like it was edited by a kindergarten class. It was that bad. Oh. And Stanton Friedman was upset. Everybody was upset. And I didn't know because when I went from Florida to West Virginia and landed in Charleston, I was on book tour and I was doing radio shows with Stanton all over the country, and we were doing talks, and people were coming back to me and saying, Frank, we don't understand your book. It's not very clear, and it's kind of hacked up, and how come you said this with Stanton on the air last week, and we're looking for it in the book, and it's not there? And I'm like, of course it is. And I was opening the book up, Kate, and it was gone.
Oh,
and so it was basically butchered, and I walked off a book tour, and I came home, and at that point I had only found about 50 mistakes, and when I went through the book with a fine-tooth comb, in the end I found out there was 154 mislabeled maps. It was very amateurishly done. So this book, nobody has laid a finger on it except me. And in the meantime, I had come across a lot of new information. I have new illustrations in there as well. I have all my master map locations and identifications. I talk about all the UFOs. This is basically a whole Flatwoods Monster book just of what happened on the 12th, the previous shoot-down orders, and then I go into the Flatwoods Monster story, what happened about a week after. So this probably has everything in the world to do with the case, and it's done right this time.
Good.
Because I did it myself.
Good. Well, I'll tell you, that's what they say, if you want it done right, right?
Exactly. This is a prime example of what happened when it got out of my hands.
All right. Well,
I'm happy with it. I'm very happy with it. I'm getting great reviews on it.
Well, you should.
Here we are back again.
All
what I want to jump into for your listeners, Kate, is as we're talking about the monster, I wanted to bring up the point about the original drawing. The original drawing had this whole thing. It looked like a monster in a cloth suit. Mm-hmm. In reality, it was some type of a hovercraft vehicle. When it had landed for the second time and relocated in the valley, it had come across the gully of the field, and then it went up the incline across a dirt path and up behind a tree, and then it settled down. Along that area, it had carved in two gigantic areas of a path. It was a hovercraft, so it looked like a gigantic leaf blower had went through the field. It was high grass. After the encounter, when it went back towards the craft, it followed and made a parallel path. And the original reporter, who was a Johnny on the spot, Ailey Stewart Jr., when I interviewed him about this, he saw the tracks that night, and he went back the following day when the sun came up, and he saw the path. and he said it was a hell of a force that had come through there. And the base of the Flatwoods craft was basically about 4 feet wide, and it tapered and towards the head. The head, which was the Ace of Spades covering, which was represented as a hood, was actually a metallic-like helmet. I work very close with Freddie May and his mom, Kathleen. Kathleen came within the length of a car. She came around a swag with Gene Lemon, and it was at dusk. The woods were to the left of the path, and there was a white oak tree that was over 100 feet tall there. As Mrs. May approached this tree, there was a sulfur-type smell. It was a gas that had come from the area, and it was a fog, and it was rolling down the hill. That's the area where they walked towards. They were looking up towards the back. They were going to see what landed on the back part of the property. So they were totally shocked when they looked over to their left, and Mrs. May and Lemon flashed a light up towards these eyes that were about 12 feet in the air. That's when this monster or craft reacted. It hovered and lifted off the ground, and it moved towards Mrs. May. Gene Lemon was paralyzed with fright momentarily. Mrs. May said his legs had got rubbery. He fell over, and they screamed. And as this thing passed in front of Mrs. May, she was near enough to it, and it was leaking, and it was splattering oil, and it shot it all over the area. When the next day, when Stuart was walking through the path that this craft had cut through the pasture, he said that it was splattered with oil. So this thing was some type of a machine with an oily-type substance. And when it hit the front of Mrs. May's uniform, it covered her from, about her neck down towards her legs. And she said it lit up from the inside, because when they saw this thing, it hadn't lit up. She said that when she hit it with the flashlight, it lit up from the inside. And Freddie told me that he saw this thing unfold. He was back quite a few feet at a second gate. So he saw this unfold, and he saw the kids in front of him, his brother and the couple adults, and he saw it come out. So when I was doing the illustrations and working with them, I had a witness who saw up close and personal. Then I had one who was standing back quite a bit who saw it unfold in front of him. So that's how I was able to get all these specific details. Mrs. May said that when it lit up from the inside, the head was not a head. It was actually a metallic-type helmet. And Freddie told me one time we were sitting down talking, and your listeners have to understand, I didn't interview these people once or twice. This was ongoing for about 20 years. We talked about this incident over and over and over. And the metallic head had porthole-type openings. These are where, this area is where the beams of light came out. It was actually a machine that lit up on the inside, and it forced the light out through the openings and went over Mrs. May and Gene Lemon's head. They were the closest. They weren't laser beams from a monster movie. That's basically what it was. And Freddie said he would compare it to being in your car at night. You're parked in your driveway, and when you start your car up, all the dashboard lights come on, and it glows everything around it. He said that's what it looked like.
Wow.
And as this thing moved towards them, it passed, and it went back down towards the craft. And the artist had drawn this monster with arms and claws. Mrs. May and Freddie said they were like antennae that were coming off the plane of the shoulder. And the Ace of Spades covering was actually an outer helmet. And Fred likened it to looking at a fighter pilot sitting in the cockpit of his jet with the canopy over the top. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
They actually saw the inner helmet with the outer helmet over the top, and this thing flared down. And if you look at the original drawing, the one thing that the artist did get correct, he drew a drop cast shadow, which was a representation of this thing had actually floated. but nobody could figure out over the years why is a monster nearly 12 foot tall floating with a dress on. Well, I went into detail with Mrs. May, and she was trying to describe to the sketch artist pipes. Freddie said what Mother was trying to describe to the public were actually pipes of an exhaust system that were going around the lower portion of the craft that flared out. And the smell of the sulfur was part of the exhaust that was shooting out of the bottom of these tubes or pipes. They were spaced equally around. Mrs. May said that these pipes reminded her of the pleats hanging in her living room in the curtains. So the artist took that literally and drew it in a dress. She was trying to tell them that it looked like pipes. So that's where the misconception came in.
Well, you can understand why they would have been frightened as well, really. We had several comments that came in, too. One from Earl was, to his understanding, the military had shoot-down orders. Those orders did not last long because we had lost a significant number of aircraft and pilots. From what he understands about Flatwood, it appears that we were winning the air conflict, which sounds implausible to him. And then Alfred answered that as a career military master aviator and combat vet, he'd always thought that we had surrendered and therefore lost that conflict. Do you have any opinions about? That's a very. The answer to that is such a long answer. What is your basic feeling on that? People should really read the book to get your answer.
Well, what I was able to figure out, there was 25 different UFOs that night. Mm-hmm. And I was able to establish this case. I'm an illustrator. People have to remember. I've done hundreds of drawings, illustrations. I could fill a museum up with all the different representations of the crafts. I knew the shapes of them, the size of them, the color of them, what direction they were flying. Just because there was 102 sightings doesn't mean there was 102 objects. I was able to establish that there were 25 different craft. Out of those 25 craft, 4 were damaged. And there were 12 crash landing sites where they were forced down, and there were actually 7 other landings in the United States when they came looking in for them. And I have the list of them. I could go over them now, but I don't want to take up too much time. But it is documented in my book. We had 4 damaged aircraft, and I give a breakdown where everyone went down. And the scary part is when they came in looking for them, they were just dropping out of the sky all over the up and down the East Coast. That's where you have 4 states bombarded by meteor-like objects, Fireball, Shower City area. They were coming in looking for them. And this was a search and rescue mission, Kate.
Well, which brings me to the point. Whatever happened to this so-called monster or landing craft? Did they ever find it, or did they find artifacts or something that were left behind?
There was metal, pieces of metal found on the farm. Okay. There was oil found on the farm. Mm-hmm. Black plastic-like material was strewn all over the farm, and it was picked up. That's where I can start talking about Colonel Dale Levitt. Colonel Dale Levitt was a combat veteran in World War II, and he was the head of the West Virginia National Guard in 1952. Well, it was known that, and it was no secret, that Colonel Levitt was up there in the following days for crowd control. He had quite a few troops up there on the Flatwoods farm. And the reason being, it was estimated there was 10,000 people that went into Flatwoods, a little town of 300 back then in 52, within 4 to 6 weeks. This is how big this story got, Kate. It was magnificent. It shot into the Asian countries. It was shotgun out through Europe. I have different articles people have sent me from around the world. So this wasn't a quiet little story. Then when Mrs. May went on national television, it got even bigger, and it was broadcast through radios, newspapers, and so So it got quite big very fast, and
Frank,
it reached outside of the UFO circles.
Frank, I hate to say this. We've got to take another quick break.
Okay.
Frank Feschino is the author of the revised and edited version, Braxton County Monster. We're on 1160 WVNJ. We'll be right back after a short break. Hi, welcome back to the Kate Valentine UFO Show on 1160 WVNJ. With us today is Mr. Frank Feschino. He's discussing his newly revised edition of the Braxton County Monster, the cover-up of the Flatwoods Monster Revealed. If you'd like to know much more about Frank's books, go to his website, flatwoodsmonster.com. If you're interested in UFOs, you definitely will not be disappointed. We had several questions, and unfortunately, Frank, I don't think we're going to have time for all of them. Alfred Lemberg has posted a link to your map. One question which was sort of interesting was Doug said, do you have an opinion as to which alien species these were? Any thoughts at all along those lines?
Well, this is where I'm going to wrap up today's show.
Okay.
Because you asked me earlier what happened to the monster after the sighting. What happened, Kate, is I went into some old newspapers from Braxton County. I went through Ivan Sanderson's documents, and I spoke to Mrs. May about this, and Colonel Levitt, who was the commander of the West Virginia National Guard. I interviewed him as well. And all his total interview is in my book. And at this part of the story, the monster had actually went back into its craft, and it took off. And it was seen by several witnesses actually traveling southwest of into Braxton County, and it crash-landed on James Knoll.
Wow.
About 17 miles away. And this is all documented.
They saw it get back into the craft and take off?
Yeah, it actually left. It was sighted by somebody in the area. A couple more people saw it. One whole community saw it. And then this thing traveled along the Elk River, and it went southwest, and it landed on James Knob, or James Knoll, 17 miles later. And the following night, basically what happened is it stayed there overnight. The craft stayed there overnight. 24 hours later, there was a couple from New York that had went on vacation to Ohio, George and Edith Snitowski. And I spoke to Mr. Snitowski on the phone, and I had the original interview from him from 1955. A researcher named Paul Lieb had interviewed Snitowski. Well, I contacted Snitowski before he died, and we went over this. And what had happened is he was coming into the Frametown area, in the area where the craft went down the night before. And his car stalled, and he pulled over to the side of the road. Something was wrong with the electrical system, shut down. And as the car pulled over to the side, they noticed George and his wife Edith, and they had their 18-month-old baby was in the back seat in its crib. They noticed this sickening sulfur smell was permeating through the area, and they started coughing and gagging, and they rolled their windows up. And George Snitowski got out of his vehicle, and he popped the hood, and he was monkeying around with the battery. The battery seemed to be dead. He got back into the car, and he was trying to start it. As they were sitting in the car, they looked out in the distance, and there was something hovering way out in the woods in a clearing, and a beam of wavering purplish light hit across the windshield of their car. George got out of the car, and he walked through the wooded area, and he started approaching this UFO. The UFO was oval-shaped and hovering and bouncing up and down on end out in the distance. As he got closer to it, Kate, he said that he felt like thousands of little electrical low-voltage shocks were going through his body as he got nearer to the craft. He backed off from it, and the smell of the sulfur started to intensify through the area. He got sick to his stomach and vomited all over the place. He leaned up against a tree to get his bearings. He started heading back towards the car, moving away from the craft that was hovering in the woods. As he neared the car, his wife had rolled the window down, and she started screaming bloody murder like a banshee.
Well, really?
The baby's crying, she's screaming. It's a really
scene.
nutty scene, and she's screaming, "George, look out, it's behind you." George Snatowski turned around, and off to his right, about 30 feet away, was what he described as a good 9-foot-tall figure.
Wow.
This figure was hovering along the edge of the road, and it started moving towards him, and it was the same movement as the Flatwoods Monster, hovering a foot to a foot and a half off the ground, like Mrs. May said. This thing was actually seen in the flesh from the waist up. The lower portion was the area with the pipes and what looked like the booster rocket. Snatowski said it was like one big giant mass, and it hovered across the road, and it came towards him. It was a good 9 foot tall. It had a big head, a bloated body, and long arms, and that came into 2 forked fingers. There wasn't 4 digits in the thumb. This thing came towards George. He almost had a heart attack. He turned and ran back towards the car, and his wife screaming bloody murder. He got back to the car, jumped in, rolled the window back up, and this thing proceeded towards the car. He took his wife and the baby, pushed them down onto the ground, onto the floor of the car, onto the passenger side. He reached into the glove box, and he had a big butcher knife hidden in there. And he laid over the top of him, and he didn't look up. He was paralyzed with fear. He said as this thing got closer towards him, it actually went around the car, went around the back of it. The back bumper came up the other side. Now the area is pretty well sickening from the sulfur smell. It was the exhaust. It came up towards the front point of the car, and at that point, he looked up and peeked up over the dashboard, and Kate, the thing was looking back down at him.
Oh, wow.
And it's actually, so it's standing in this hovercraft, and it leaned over the hood of the car, and Snatowski says it reached down with its forked fingers and touched the hood of the car and burnt the paint right down through into the primer.
Wow.
And he was watching this thing, and it was like a reptilian, kind of like a snake reptile, its head, and it backed off away from the car and turned and hovered back into the woods. And George says a couple minutes later, after it disappeared into the woods, he saw the UFO lift, and it cleared the top of the trees over the area, and it went into a swinging pendulum motion, which is not uncommon because there's thousands of sightings where witnesses have said it looked like a pendulum motion, and it started swinging back and forth, and it took off, and it disappeared. George got his wits about him. They got back up onto the car seats, and he started frantically, instinctively started starting the car, and the car started up once the craft was going out of the area. He went into a local truck stop in the Sutton area, and he got his bearings about him, and he kept quiet about this story for a little while, and then he went public with it in 1955. I spoke to him in the early 90s, and he verified that everything that happened was 100% true, and except the point that this thing looked more additional information that looked more like a reptile or a snake. Subsequently, Ivan Sanderson had went to a crash site in Sugar Creek. That was the other location where the other damaged object went down. And he found coiled up pieces of material, and they kind of look like party blowers.
Oh, Frank, no. Talk about cliffhangers.
Right?
That music means we only have another minute. Thank you so much for this extraordinarily important early 1950s historical era book. I think you are going to be a reference book sometime in the next few coming decades. So again, where's your book available?
on my website, flatwoodsmonster.com, and there's pictures of the reptilian on there that I was getting to.
Okay, you got to take a look at this out there. Go to that website. So thanks again, Frank. As always, thanks to both Bill and Dave and our sponsors. Mostly thank you for listening. Sorry we could not get to all your comments. They were wonderful. We'll see you next Friday at 1. And until then, remember, keep your eye on the sky, but don't watch the reptilians.